Good afternoon, everybody. Today it's my honor to introduce Dr. Bob Wortmann. First, a short background covering Dr. Wortmann's life story. Bob was born in Chicago, Illinois. He grew up in the Kansas City area. After receiving his bachelor's degree from Carleton College in Minnesota, he attended Kansas School of Medicine. There he met and married his biochemistry lab partner, Dorothy. After 2 years of residency at the University of Michigan, he was inducted into the U.S. Army Medical Corps and was stationed at the 43rd Surgical Hospital. It's a MASH unit in South Korea. Upon discharge from the Army, he returned to the University of Michigan to do a fellowship in rheumatology. So no rumors around Bob. Before retiring, Dr. Wortmann was recognized as a fellow of the American College of Physicians and a master of the American College of Rheumatology. Please join me in welcoming our friend and neighbor, Dr. Bob Wortmann.
Well, thank you, Lee. I don't have anything to say. He said it all. I really want to thank you for this opportunity, though. Like most of you, we moved, probably many of you anyway, we moved here with about 5 big boxes of photographs. And this gave me an excuse to go through all of those, throw about 80% of them away, or give them to my kids, and put this together. So now we're down to 1 box. Yes, I was born in Chicago, and you'll see numbers on this. This is the number of places I've lived. And at age 2, we moved to Kansas City, where I developed my fondness for anything that involved a ball. My youth was spent completely involved with sports. And it didn't matter what ball it was, I enjoyed playing with it. When I was in the 6th grade, we moved all of 4 blocks, but to another state. In Shawnee Mission, Kansas, I don't know if you know the Kansas City area, it's actually divided by a 2-lane road called State Line. One side's Missouri, the other side's Kansas. We moved 4 blocks, but to another state. And during that time, I had my first jobs. One was delivering flowers, but then in the summers, I started working at a camp and ranch out in Colorado, where I had a lot of fun with the young kids. After graduation from high school, I did go to Carleton College, which is in Northfield, Minnesota. And there, I played football. That's my picture of my senior year. I weighed 215 pounds. I was the 3rd heaviest guy on our team. Now, when I was a freshman, I weighed 162 pounds. So I grew during college. Now, my wife has seen, this is one of my favorite pictures, I have to admit. But my wife said if she saw me looking like that, she'd never have gone out with me. In 1967, I started medical school at the University of Kansas in Kansas City. And in the 2nd semester, because of the alphabetical order, I was paired with a young woman for my lab partner in biochemistry, Ms. Dorothy Wortmann. And she'd been a chemistry major in college, and I'd been a biology major, so biochemistry, it worked out really well. She did the experiments, and I cleaned up afterwards. And I'll come back to that cleaning up afterwards a little bit later. We studied together at first, and we did real well at first. But over the next few months, as we studied together and wrote up lab experiments together, one day I asked her, did she play tennis? And she said yes. So I went back, got my racket, came over, picked her up. We went to this little local park, had 2 little courts. And I hit the ball over, and the ball went, went back, picked up the ball, boop. Oh, shit. Hit the ball back, bloop, it came back. Bloop, bloop. She hadn't told me. She was number 1 on her high school tennis team. We played a lot of tennis after that, but she'd never play a set. I said, don't you want to play a set? She said, no. She later admitted to me that she wouldn't play a set until she was sure I could beat her. So in 1969, we got married on June 14th, which means in 2 days we will have been married 54 years. And we graduated from medical school and headed off to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I did a residency, internship, and started residency in internal medicine, and she started in pediatrics. But our training was cut short because of the Berry Plan. So what's the Berry Plan? Well, it was a program that the armed services used to guarantee they had the right number of subspecialists in the future. So they would know that in 4 years from now they had commitments from, say, a certain number of internal medicine specialists. They knew how many they needed, and the difference, those numbers that they needed, they allowed for medical students in their senior year to enter a lottery to see if they could complete their training or go into the service after their internship or first year of residency. When you applied for the Berry Plan, it said choose the 5 stations in the continental United States that you'd like to serve in order of preference. And so you'd list them. The next question was, do you volunteer for overseas duty? No. Even if you do not volunteer for overseas duty, list the 5 theaters in order of preference. There were 6 theaters. Not only did I get what I didn't volunteer for, I got the 1 theater I didn't list as one of my preferences. So I lost the lottery twice. They held it after your first year, and if you didn't get it, you opt for another year of training or go in right away, or take training and go in after the second year, which is what I chose. So I lost twice in the lottery and had to go in as a general medical officer and was assigned to the 43rd Surgical Hospital Mobile Army in Namdang-ni, South Korea. So a little history about this hospital. It was originally activated in 1943 as a portable surgical hospital. I guess that was a PSHA. I don't know how you say PSH, but that was my attempt. And it was sent to Burma to support the troops building the Burma Road, which was meant to supply China with arms during World War II to fight the Japanese. I found it interesting that the first unit had 5 officers and 33 corpsmen. And when they were deployed on the first day, 5 days, they did 93 surgeries. Only one of the corpsmen had ever seen a surgery before. Talk about on-the-job training. After the Korean War, it was deactivated, but reactivated in 1950 and moved to Korea. And in 1953, it settled, and in 50 they called it a MASH. But in 1953, after the war ended, it settled where it was today when I got there, and was renamed the 43rd Surgical Hospital, quote, Mobile Army. I wondered if it wasn't because of the movie that they renamed it from MASH to SHMA. But it turns out the reason was it was supposed to be stationary and have the potential to be mobile. So what were my duties at the MASH hospital? Well, I was a general medical officer, which basically meant I had to do everything that the other doctors didn't want to do, because they were all fully trained. I was actually the number 30 surgeon, even though I had no surgery training other than a rotation in medical school. I often go in the OR with them to assist, and I found that very interesting. And it turned out pretty handy on New Year's Eve because I was the only sober doctor on a unit. And lo and behold, at 12:30 on January 1st, a GI comes in with acute appendicitis. And the surgeon, who was supposed to be on call, said, "You can do it." So I went into the OR, very good scrub nurse, and I started and got lucky. The appendix, sometimes they're hard to find, but this one just popped right up. And the surgeon came in and looked over his shoulder and said, "Well, how you doing?" I said, "I think fine." And I sewed it off and cut it, and as I was taking it out, it burst. And he said, "Don't worry, just close them with the drain in the incision, and everything will be fine." And everything was fine. I was also the lab officer. We did type and cross match for blood transfusions. We could do cultures. We could do complete blood counts. We could do 4 other blood tests. And we could look for ova and parasites, because every Korean had at least 3 parasites. And these were worms. And in fact, once in the OR, it was a Korean soldier had come in and had been kicked in the abdomen doing taekwondo, a martial arts. And he had ruptured something in one of his intestines. And it was easy to find the hole because they opened him up and there was a worm from the hole. Yeah. I was also the radiology officer, the TB control officer, the VD control officer. I did in charge of doing premarital physicals on Korean women who were going to marry GIs and then move back to the States. And I also had orders to be the nuclear Holocaust control officer. And I want you to know I was very successful at the latter. There was not one nuclear holocaust the whole time I was in Korea. I wasn't so good with the VD. There were 50,000 troops in Korea that year and 110,000 documented cases of venereal disease. And that's not counting the officers that had non-specific urethritis. We had 5 doctors, 12 nurses, 10 helicopter pilots, 100 enlisted men, 15 Katusas, this was Korean Army soldiers assigned to the U.S. Army, and 5 Korean citizens, one of which had started working at that MASH hospital during the Korean War. He was 15 at that time. He's still working there in the OR. What was our mission? We were to provide emergency support and triage for the troops stationed along the demilitarized zone. We would provide medical and surgical care for troops with less severe problems. We had to be ready to mobilize, but we also provided care for about a 300 population leper colony that was about 2 miles from us. And we provided care for Korean citizens when we had the capacity. And we almost always did. We had a 50-bed hospital. So Camp Mosier was our compound in which the 43rd Surgical Hospital Mobile Army was located. And this is a view from inside our compound, looking out at the village of Nambani, which is in here on this hillside. This is actually Rosie's Bar. And behind it was the upper pad. Those of you who remember the movie, the TV show, there was an upper pad and a lower pad, Rosie's Bar. They were all real. Front door to our hospital. Our buildings were either cinder block or Quonset huts. We had very stark exam rooms. Our radiology equipment was rather primitive. To do fluoroscopy, we had to dark adapt, which means we had to put on red goggles for about a half an hour before we would look at the x-rays. And also lead aprons, which we have on there. So one day, it was real busy for sick call, and I was dark adapting So I got my red goggles on, my lead apron. So I go in to see a patient. And you know what you can't see if you got red goggles on? Color red. What do you think he had? A rash. Here was our little hospital. Wasn't much privacy there. And patients would come to us either arriving in a Cracker Barrel ambulance if they weren't too acute. If they're moderately acute and came from far away, they came to the upper pad and were brought down to the hospital in one of these ambulances. And if they were really sick, they came to the lower pad in the helicopter landing there. This was a picture that was in our waiting room for our hospital. And you can see it's from the crew of the TV show with Colonel Blake, Radar, Hawkeye, Trapper, Hot Lips, and Frank Burns. With our motto down there, best care anywhere. So we posed for a picture like that too. And this was Colonel Service. He was our CO. He had gone to West Point, served as a line officer in the Berlin Wall crisis, and then went to medical school, finished a surgical residency, and was sent to Korea. This gentleman was an anesthesiologist. He had the greatest job of all because they rarely were operating more than 2 or 3 hours a day, and the rest of the time he didn't have to do anything. It was George. This was Bill Pfeiffer. He was a surgeon. This is Jeff Field. He was an internist, fully trained, but just out of our training. And this was our hot lips, Melinda Gage. And this was me. And I got to sit in Hawkeye's place because I was the quarterback of our football team. Now, Loretta Swit was very attractive. But, you know, who's going to argue with that? Melinda was very smart. She was a good nurse and a very nice person. And she was so smart that when she got out of Korea, she left the Army and married an orthopedic surgeon. This was our clinic at the leper colony. As I said, there were 300 people that lived there, all ages. And this is an example of a lepromatous lesion of dry leprosy. As I mentioned, we also took care of Korean nationals with various problems, some of which were rather severe, as is this case. This was a gentleman who worked for an equivalent of 50 cents a week in rice paddies. He had a family of 5 kids. And one night in the winter, he went out to a makgeolli house. And makgeolli is a very strong rice wine. So he went to the bar. And leaving the bar, he passed out in the snow, fell down, got frostbite of both hands, both feet, and developed tetanus. There's only one. Tetanus is an infection where a toxin, it's also called lockjaw, and so the toxin binds to receptors so that your muscles are clenched and spasm unless you're sedated, and the toxin can stay in the body for many, many weeks. And so the way you treat this is you ventilate the person and keep them sedated until the toxin goes away. And it took 6 weeks. He was on a ventilator for 6 weeks. It went away. He survived. And we were able to get him fit with prostheses for all 4 extremities. And so that was one of our more severe cases. So in October of 1973, Dottie arrives in Seoul. She says, even though you're on an unaccompanied tour, I'm coming over there. And when we found out we were going to Korea, we met a person who had been in the Army in Korea, in Ann Arbor. He had just come back, and he said, oh, they need pediatricians at the 121 Evac Hospital, the big hospital in Seoul. And so we'd written the commanding officer, and he wrote us back and said, of course, when you get to the country, come to personnel and we'll hire you. We'd love to have you. Well, between the time we wrote the letter and got to Seoul, Dottie was pregnant. And the Army that commanding officer had left. He rotated to another duty station. And they did not know what to do with a woman pediatrician who's pregnant, whose husband's on an unassigned tour and stationed in a tactical zone. But after 6 weeks of fumbling around with paperwork or whatever, they finally did hire her. And the two pediatricians that were there were delighted. And then there was this issue of taking call. Well, there were no call rooms in the hospital. And because I was in a tactical zone and on an unaccompanied tour, she could not get base housing on the base where the hospital was. And for the same reason, she couldn't get a car. And in Seoul at that time, there was a curfew from midnight to 5. So without a car, she couldn't get to the hospital. So what's the solution for her taking call? She doesn't have to. That made her happy, but the other two pediatricians were livid, not only because of that, but she was making more money than they were. But she had to deal with a lot in Seoul. The first was there's no potable water. We had to boil our water every day and soak our vegetables in Clorox. And you go to the refrigerator to get your water to brush your teeth. It was rather inconvenient, but you got used to it. And the reason was you didn't want to get hepatitis or those parasites that were so prevalent. She also had to deal with rationing. There was a big black market going on in Korea at that time. And so things were rationed. And Korea was a very primitive country at this time. And she was also told that when she left her apartment, she should always go out with some Korean money and directions in Korea, written in Korean, to get back to her apartment. So this is a list of some of the things that were rationed and how many you could get per year, mostly small electronic devices because they went on to the black market very rapidly. And some of it pretty basic foodstuffs were rationed. Coffee, mayonnaise, olive oil, pepper, salad oil, and Tang. Korean people loved Tang. And the other thing she'd tell you that when she'd go to the commissary to buy these things, she had to go with somebody else because if you left anything in your cart when you went into the room where you got the controlled substances, any controlled substances or foods or whatever, not substances, no drugs, that somebody would take them out of your cart if it wasn't guarded. So that was a challenge for her. So they said it was a primitive country. Outside of Seoul or the big cities, all the roofs were thatched. While we were there, Park Chung-hee, who was the president, declared there would be no more thatched roofs in Korea, and they started getting rid of them. But they were plentiful then. And if you look over here, you see this flue or pipe. The Koreans used a rather ingenious method of heating their houses. They had a charcoal burner at one end outside that connected to pipes that ran under the floor and then up the other side. So that kept the floor warm, and they sat on the floor and they slept on the floor. And it was great. The only problem was sometimes they would buy pipes which were actually soda cans that had been soldered together. And if the solder broke down at all, that allowed carbon monoxide to come in, and there was a lot of carbon monoxide poisoning that occurred. We saw it not just from Korean people, but occasionally, believe it or not, some GIs might sleep in some of those huts at night. Believe it or not. The rice paddies were plentiful, and rather basic equipment. I don't know how they did it, but much of the clothing the Koreans wore was white. And this is a woman washing clothing in the Han River, which goes right through Seoul. It's the dirtiest thing you can ever see. How they got the clothes white, I don't know, but they did. This is not in good focus, but this is a broom. It's a stick with a bush that's lost its leaves tied to the bottom of it. You couldn't believe how much they could put on a bicycle. I once saw in the village next to our post, our hospital, they put a 300-pound pig on the back of a bicycle. They loaded it up with Mockley, got it drunk, so it'd be sedated. And it took 3 people to put it on the back of this bike. And the guy started down, but it was a downhill. He didn't make it all the way. That pig squealed, oh man. And trees were not real common in the part of Korea where I was, which was halfway between Seoul and the demilitarized zone. So they didn't want to do anything bad about them, so if they built a road, they didn't move the tree. This is a crew picking up river rocks in the Han River. I guess you just drive your truck down the middle of the river. This is a man painting the lines in the street. And this is a man, he's changing a light bulb. How many Koreans does it take to change a light bulb? One to screw in the bulb and one to hold the ladder. So as I said, when she was to leave her apartment, she was supposed to have Korean money and directions to her apartment written in Korean. But about her second or third Friday in country, she was coming up to spend the weekend with me. I had every other weekend off, so I would go to Seoul the weekends off, and often she'd come up the weekend I had to stay on. And I arrived on base called an alert. And this is where everybody has to muster. They bring the helicopters from the upper pad to the lower pad. They turn on every vehicle's lights and engines. And usually these lasted about 15 minutes. Once everybody was accounted for, they said, okay, let's drill, go away. Well, half an hour later, after this started, I said, what's going on? And my executive officer said, this is not a drill. And I said, but my wife's on the bus coming from Seoul. He said, they won't let her off. Did she have directions and currency? No. Well, as the bus turned around, an MP went out and stood in front of it and stopped it, got on the bus and said, Dr. Wortmann, come with me. My commanding officer had realized that we only had 5 doctors. We were supposed to have 12, and he conscripted her into the military. So she did get off the bus. They took her to my quarters and told her to stay there. And she was pretty nervous, but she got really nervous when I came in because I had a gun. They had issues with guns. I am the worst shot in the world. In basic training, they gave us a 45 and had us shoot at a target 10 yards in front of us. Had the silhouette of a man and a bullseye. 6 rounds. 2 in the target. I was so embarrassed. We go out to the rifle range. I'm really going to try now. I'm fairly competitive. And I sight this thing in, and it's 50 yards out to these targets, and they're all lined up next to each other. And I fire off my 50 rounds. And everybody go out and look at the target. I go out and look at my target. 2 freaking holes in the whole target. 2 out of 50. I look at the next to me, and here stands Dr. Shelley Zuckerman. Shelley was from Brooklyn. He was 5'8", weighed 240 pounds. He couldn't get in the back of a 2.5-ton truck by himself, but his target was riddled. So I either missed wide right or aimed at the wrong target. Anyway, guns and I don't have anything to do with each other. We were on alert because we were supposed to be going to to Israel. This was a worldwide alert back in 1973. And we were on alert for 48 hours until finally it got called off. But we were pretty nervous during that time. So, as I said, mission included being ready